Let's talk about Pendulum. Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, I wanted to talk about Pendulum. The good, the bad, and where overall I think Konami went wrong with this archetype. Or summoning mechanic, sorry. Let's talk about it, starting at the beginning. And I want to more specifically talk about this objectively. A lot of people may know me for being the Pendulum hater, which is not really true. I do actually like Pendulum, I just think that Konami did fail it, and because of that, it is incredibly frustrating. I've played a whole bunch of I've played a few Pendulum decks, and it's because I do want to give it a try. I'm not averse to it, I want it to be better than it is. It's always disappointing when I end up playing it, and I want to talk about why I feel that way from a more objective standpoint. Hopefully this comes off as that, but we'll see. Anyway, let's start off, again, with the concept. I do believe that the concept of a spell monster is pretty good. We already had trap monsters, think of the Tikis, or the myriad of other random trap monsters, like embodiment of Apophis, or what have you, that existed prior to Pendulums. It does make sense. Hey, trap monster, you activate a trap to summon a monster. Cool. What if we made a spell monster? Where that, I believe, went wrong, we'll get into later, but overall, still a good idea. And you can actually see two different ways that something like this could work in Magic the Gathering. Now, why am I bringing up Magic the Gathering? Very simple, but I do believe that Magic the Gathering has a good formula for something like a spell monster, or basically two cards in one, and that is split cards. Split cards happen to be very good cards just in general, and end up being pretty unique to the different decks that they can be played in. Like, for example, Odds and Ends here is a card that not only requires red mana, but also requires blue, or if you're playing the other mana, if you want to utilize the other effect, it also requires a white mana, meaning that it can either be splashed in a red and blue deck, a red and white deck, or in a red, blue, white deck, and you can utilize both effects. Now, this is something that wouldn't necessarily work as well in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but something along these lines could have, right? And I do think the concept for a split card could have been very interesting. A monster that can also just be activated straight up as a spell, similar to something like a Raigeki or in Aluber. I don't know why those were the two cards that I thought of, but that's something that could happen, right? A Rhoda and another Rhoda, right? So that's something that obviously could have existed, and you'd basically just play it as a spell or as a monster. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's something that needs to happen, but it is an idea. The second thing is a kicker. A kicker is rather new in terms of Magic, kind of, I should say, but basically it means that you can play the cost of the card, which is right up here. For this Goblin Barrage, it's 3 colorless mana and then 1 red mana, and it basically plays the standard effect, right? This thing right down here. The Goblin Barrage deals 4 damage to a target creature. Then you can play a kicker effect, which is basically another effect, to get that secondary effect, or a bonus effect, or make it better, or something like that, which in this case is you sacrifice an artifact or a goblin. Then, if the spell was kicked, you deal 4 damage to target player or planeswalker. This is overall pretty good. It's 4 damage for a 4 mana cost, or you can kick it to sacrifice an additional monster in order to deal an additional 4 damage. Overall, pretty good. So, that is something that could have worked in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm not saying that that's something that I would have wanted, but it's just something, hey, these ideas already happen, they exist, they're things that could work within the guidelines of Yu-Gi-Oh!, right? Paying an additional cost to play a spell effect on a monster, something like that, or playing a monster, or creating a monster, similar to like creating a token, but it's an actual effect monster, or something along those lines, could be something worth noting, right? That's something that could happen within Yu-Gi-Oh! And is something that is feasible. Now, with that being said, even in the actual mechanic of having a spell that is a monster, having it be specifically a pendulum, with a pendulum scale, with a pendulum effect, etc., and how the overall pendulum works, I still think is a good idea. But I do think that from that point, it starts to break down. with the core mechanics and actually how they do end up functioning, it starts to become very convoluted and messy. It's not something that's easy to understand, similar to something like Link Monsters, and it's overly not really worth the payoff because it is a main deck mechanic that doesn't necessarily enhance every deck and is very Pendulum centric, which is similar to something like Rituals, right? It kind of plays off of the two weaknesses of two different blue cards. And because of that, I do think that Pendulum overall kind of failed in its execution, right? Because I'm going to say this now and we'll get into it later. I do believe that Pendulum from the get-go was determined, or was basically made to be either absolutely broken or bad. That's kind of it. It was either going to be absolutely insane and provide insane advantage and break formats and just forever be a problem, or be absolutely nothing. It was a seesaw determined by Konami. Alright, let's get into the actual problems with Pendulum. And that is, first and foremost, pendulums don't really work the way that I think they're supposed to work. Or more specifically, I feel like pendulums should have worked in a different way. And the reason I say this is because pendulums are very, very complicated just with the way that they inherently function. For example, they're only kind of spells. They're also only kind of monsters. Sometimes when they activate in the spell and trap card zone, they count as a spell effect, right? So in the pendulum zone, they count as a spell effect, right? But if they're destroyed from the pendulum zone, they trigger monster effects. Why? Because Konami said so, right? Why is it that when they are sent to the graveyard, they go to the face-up extra deck, unless they are detached as a material, or some other convoluted reason, or, for example, when you actually send them from the deck to the grave, it's only if they are sent from the field, do they go to the face-up extra deck. Why is this the case? Because Konami said so. Why is it that instead of being sent to the graveyard under a Macrocosmos or Dimension Shifter, they are banished? Or, instead of going to the face-up extra deck, they're banished. Why is that the case? Because Konami said so. There's a lot of things like that that don't really make a whole lot of sense and are just kind of knowledge checks, right? As a new player, could you realistically understand how Pendulum works just by reading the cards? No. And that's a massive issue, and not something that is inherent to other such archetypes or other such mechanics, right? If you know how pendulums work, sure, you can be like, cool, that's a spell, it's going to activate a spell effect, I'm going to pop it, I'm going to not allow them to activate that spell effect, and then it triggers the monster effect, and now you're confused, because why would it do that? No other spell does that. Why does this pendulum have to do that? Right? And something like a Synchro monster isn't really going to do that. Something like an Xyz monster doesn't really do that, unless they're very specific Xyz or Synchros, right? But the whole of the archetype, the whole of the pendulum mechanic, kind of functions that way. There's a lot of things that just don't really work the way that they should. Like, for example, why is it that on the pendulum card, there's two scales? There's the left scale and the right scale. Do those matter? No. You just need the one scale. Because guess what? Both on the left and on the right, they are the same number. Now, I do think that originally Konami did intend to have a monster that could be scaled in either the left zone or the right zone and have different actual scales, but they didn't do anything with that. So it just adds to the convolution and the confusion. On top of that, genuinely, this is one of the more confusing mechanics. Like, links are confusing, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they aren't, and things like Xyz can also be confusing in terms of their mechanics. Like, for example, detaching, when does that trigger something being sent from the field to the grave? Does it not? Why is that the case? It can be confusing, but in terms of sheer quantity of confusing things that Pendulum does, I do feel like it is just a bit too much, and it's another reason why I think that overall people don't like the mechanic, right? It's just too much. It kind of failed in that regard. And because pendulums are only ever activatable and not actually being able to be set, because they're not ever actually spells until they're actually activated, things like Anti-Spell just entirely shut down the deck. Why does that function that way? Because Konami said so. It shouldn't. If they're a spell, they should be able to be set. like most other spells, which wouldn't cause issues with anti-spell fragrance. Sure, you can still only set them in the Pendulum zones, that should be fine, but why can't you? Because technically they're monsters, unless they're activated. Then they're spells. And again, it's just because Konami said so. And all of this on top of Konami's pretty terrible handling when it comes to the mechanic itself, kind of destined it to fail. I do think that the overcomplicated nature of it, as well as the weird amalgamation of it being either really broken because of the ability to pen summon 5 every turn and get insane advantage, as well as being able to generically pendulum summon out monsters that were not designed to be pendulum summoned, like Jinzo, make the mechanic very xenophobic. You can't really play Pendulum decks without just maxing out on Pendulum monsters, because Konami basically said, that's not allowed. We can't allow you to have better archetypes and better cards, because if we do, all of a sudden, it's going to break the game. Do I disagree? Not necessarily. The first time they really printed some actually decent generic cards for Pendulum, they made Pepe. And we know how that went. Another thing about Pendulum that I do want to point out is the fact that Pendulum is in a weird middle ground where basically you need to play more Pendulums than anything else in your main deck, and because of that you kind of are cut off from things like your non-engine, right? You can't really play that high of a count of non-engine, like for example hand traps or what have you, and so that makes it a lot less flexible. It's a lot more meta-reliant and stuff like that. But even more so than that, it's also very reliant on the extra deck. And more specifically, the generic cards within the extra deck. Pendulum gets significantly stronger if the generic cards that it can summon are also stronger. But they're never really going to print a good Pendulum archetype, because the good generic cards are what Pendulum, as a whole, is designed around. Things like Baron are easy to access because Pendulum can be tuners, Pendulums can be non-tuners, etc. Things like Xyz also help, and again, it's because the mechanic is kind of centered around summoning out a whole bunch of guys, and utilizing that extra deck, while also still being kind of xenophobic. It's very weird, and in a very weird spot that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's split in its nature. It wants the help from the extra deck, and kind of needs the help from the extra deck to do anything, but it doesn't allow any of the main deck help to really round it out. It is very just cut and set in its ways. Now, I will say, Konami has been going in a different direction and has been allowing Pendulum to kind of adapt. Let's talk about that. Now, this is a topping list from the OCG, and I want you to notice something. They're playing non-engine. This isn't something that is normal for Pendulum decks unless they're playing 60 cards. And the reason for this is because you need a critical mass of your Pendulum cards, and more specifically, your Pendulum scales. However, if you notice, they're actually playing one-ofs. One of Purple Poison, which is a good scale, one of Oath Dragon, which is a good scale, and a bunch of other things like that, as well as a whole bunch of non-engine and even power spells. Why is this? Well, because Konami finally printed cards that allow them to actually get scales, which is quite a bright spot in the dark void that is Pendulum, or that has been Pendulum for the longest time. So let's actually talk about some of the good that Konami is doing, and what I do like about Pendulum. I've been talking a lot about the bad, but I do want to talk about some of the things that are going well, and that kind of bring a bright spot to Pendulum in the moving forward stage. That sounded weird. Cards like Supreme King Gate Magician, as well as the Valmonikas and the Nemerelias, are bright spots, at least in my eyes, for Konami and for Pendulum. There's also a few others that I want to talk about, and we'll get to that in a second, but these cards, Wakaushi, etc., have really revitalized what Pendulum summoning can be, and more specifically, what Pendulums can do, right? Supreme King is great support to give you Pendulum scales, as well as the ability to actually utilize those scales consistently in a Pendulum archetype. This is fantastic, not only for Pendulum, but more so in solidifying an archetype that Pendulum summons and utilizes powerful Pendulum mechanics. Then you have things like Wakaushi, as well as the other super heavy samurais, that really facilitate the idea of, hey, these are monsters as well as spells to help you actually summon out additional monsters to make super heavy samurai viable. not only viable, but really strong, at least in the TCG. I don't know about the OCG, it was decent in the OCG. So all in all, pretty good as well. There are also some different ideas that Konami has been playing with things like the Valmonicas, as well as Nemorelia, kind of utilizing the Pendulum zones as more of staging areas for other cards, right? You basically utilize the Pendulum zones instead of to Pendulum summon, but now to actually basically act as waiting zones for a monster, right? The Nemorelia, the Valmonicas, and stuff like that. Or we can even look at support cards like Jord, or the Nouvelle card, which I don't really know the name of, and I'm probably going to butcher if I attempt to say it. These two cards are some of my favorite Pendulum cards of all time, and are genuinely good cards. I love Plunder Patrol, and honestly, Jord is a fantastic addition, because getting that spell and monster effect is very advantageous. The fact that it's something that I can summon from the extra deck, and is generically usable, that gives me additional advantage, has a decent monster effect, and giving the spell effect also allows me to generate additional advantage. It's not something that I hate to summon, and it's not something that I am forced to use. It's something that is actively advantageous. And similarly, the Nouvelle card allows it to actually utilize its Pendulum effect almost as well as a monster effect, whereas a lot of, I think, previous Pendulum monsters really didn't use that spell effect as any more than just a way to get another monster, especially things like Valence. Valence, basically, their whole gimmick is just vomit out more monsters, which Pendulum has been doing for quite some time. Now, the last thing that I do want to talk about is Electromite. I think that this card is very contentious when it comes to talking about Pendulum, and I think it should be banned. Now, I know just before you write a comment talking about how terrible I am and my terrible opinions, that's fine. You can absolutely do that. You can have your own opinions, but I do want to point out the fact that Electromite has caused a lot of issues similar to things like Halqifibrax. Now, yes, Halqifibrax was definitely stronger because it actually summoned the monster to the field and generated just significantly more advantage. But Electromite does similar things. Electromite existing and being within the game means that a lot of decks center around this particular card, and honestly almost don't function without this card. And that's not necessarily something that I want Pendulum to be focused around. A lot of the decks end up just being Electromite Turbo to generate advantage to grab up this guy, Astrograph Sorcerer. Now, I would much prefer it to be banned alongside Astrograph Sorcerer if we were to get actual good Pendulum archetypes that don't center around these two cards or their gimmick of popping cards and doing yada yada. You know, it would be really interesting to see an actual archetype that utilized the Pendulum mechanic as more than just Electromite Turbo to generate a whole bunch of bodies and go from there, but instead use something like Magispector did, or even Klee, right? They're not exactly the best, but honestly, they're more of what I would like to see in terms of the mechanics for the Pendulum archetype. Maybe we can't Pendulum summon a whole lot of monsters, but more specific monsters, and maybe instead of utilizing the monsters as generic extra deck material, they're utilized for their on-field effect, or even for their Pendulum scale effect. That would be pretty nice. Think Dino Mist, right? The Pendulum scales are just as important as the actual bodies on field. Sure, again, the archetype isn't good, but it's at least something that I feel like Pendulum could have been, and it just isn't. And again, I do think it's mostly due to this guy. Basically, every deck kind of centers around this guy, and if the deck doesn't do that, well, it's not all that great. Most people won't play it, or it won't be very good. And I do think that, again, it would be way cooler if we just banned this card and then got actual good archetypes, because guess what? Halqifibrax did similar things to Synchro monsters, or more specifically, not Synchro monsters, but tuners in particular. We couldn't really get any good tuners while that card was legal, and in fact we banned several of them. Jet Synchron should not have been banned. That card is not that good. It's a good card, but it's not ban-worthy. Maybe a limitation at most, but because of Halqifibrax, it was banned. Same with O-Lion. Does that card deserve to be banned? Not in the slightest. And Electromite, I feel like, has a similar function, basically. Why is Kieran on the ban list? Well, because Electromite exists. This card could absolutely go to 3, and honestly, it could go to 3 with or without Electromite being banned. But it's still on the list, because Konami fears what this card can do with Electromite, right? And so, I can understand saying, hey, Electromite's needed. Hey, you gotta play Electromite. Hey, this card's important. But I'd much rather see it banned, just like Halqifibrax, so that I don't have to deal with not actually getting a good Pendulum archetype, right? And now Konami is coming around, as we mentioned previously, and honestly, a lot of the decks are becoming more than Pepe. I think post-Pepe, most of the decks basically function very similarly. You utilize the mechanic to get Pendulum scales, you use those scales in order to summon out additional monsters, and then Pendulum summon a whole bunch of them, utilize all of those for generic monsters, and then have a whole bunch of negates. And basically your turn 1 board is an FTK. That's the overall goal, and that's what you're trying to do. Now granted, that's not entirely the case, but it mostly is, and that's not exactly great. So, again, I have hope for Pendulum, and I'm excited to see what Konami does with it, but I do think that Pendulum has been failed as a mechanic. It really doesn't have the depth as things like Synchro Monsters or even Xyz, and definitely not Fusions, and it's not nearly as powerful nor as just robust in its diversity as Lynx. So, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. I obviously would love to see Pendulum be better, just in general, and be more fun and diverse, and not such a headache to play. It genuinely is way too much for me to play. It's not really worth the payoff. Why play Pendulum that's just as complicated when you could play Spiral and be more rewarded, you know? But alas, that's basically all that I have to say. I do want to end on one last thing, which is, why is Pendulum so gosh diggity darn expensive? Look at how expensive this is. Why? Why is every deck, like, stupidly expensive? That's all. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy. If you did, I like this very much. So appreciate it. And if you want to check out more content like this, then just be sure to subscribe. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.